Hello, my name is Brad Carlin, and this is my review of Help, Thanks, Wow, The Three Essential Prayers by Anne Lamott. So I'll start with an overview and description of the book. I'll talk about a review of what's inside the book. I'll then talk about its strengths and its deficits and its significance overall. I'll talk about the relevance to music therapy practice, and I'll also talk about its relevance to my own particular area of music therapy, which is working with persons with dementia and their family caregivers. And then I'll talk about conclusions and give the full reference for the book. So the author of the book is Anne Lamott. She was born in 1954, and she's a popular American novelist and nonfiction writer. Her nonfiction works are largely autobiographical, and they're filled with self-disclosure and self-deprecating humor. She's written on a range of difficult subjects, including alcoholism and substance dependence, single motherhood and depression, all of things she's personally experienced in her life. She's not a Christian author per se, but she is a Christian, and her Christian faith definitely does infuse a lot of her work. Her breakout book was called Bird by Bird, Some Instructions on Writing and Life, and that was published back in 1994. I found a nice quote by her in the Dallas Morning News from about 14 years ago. She says, "I try to write the books that I would love to come upon, that are honest, concerned with real lives, human hearts, spiritual transformation, families, secrets, wonder, craziness, and that can make me laugh. I try to write these kinds of books. Books for me are medicine." And I was really struck by that quote, since we often think of music as medicine in music therapy. So here's an overview of the book. Anne believes in keeping prayer simple. She believes in God, but she has a pretty broad idea of God and a lot of other things related to God. For example, she has a broad idea of what God really might mean. It could mean just the animating energy of love. She also refers to it as something unimaginably big and not us. So I like that description a lot. She says what name you assign to the object of prayer is also very flexible. You can call this object God. You can call it the good. You can call it the really real. You can call it the force, especially if you're into Star Wars. And she also mentions the name Howard, which is based on I guess, a mispronunciation of the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. I think she heard a child say that one time, and she liked that. I like it too. She also has a broad idea of what constitutes prayer. She talks about prayer like children's prayers. Now I lay me down to sleep. She talks about, raging against God. I hate you, God, based on bad things that have happened to you. That still counts as prayer, she says. She thinks of stillness as being a form of prayer. She thinks of seeking union or communication with the real or the truth or the light as being prayer. So her idea of God and her idea of prayer are both very broad. And her main point in the book is that all prayers essentially boil down to one of three key messages, and that's the title of the book: Help, Thanks, and Wow. So let's look at those in turn. Help is what she refers to as the first great prayer, as in help me or help us get through this life we're living, the difficulties we face. She prays that people who are hurting will be filled with air and light. She says air and light heal. They somehow get into those dark, musty places like spiritual antibiotics. It's another great phrase of hers I like. She discusses how people can survive unsurvivable losses, like the loss of a child, for example, and then experience a happiness again, and wonders how on earth can this be? The quote from the book I found on this was, "Love flowed to them from their closest persons and from their community. It surrounded them, sat with them, held them, fed them, swept their floors. Time passed, and in most cases, their pain evolved slowly into help for others." So service is another feature of this book that she comes back to a lot. She also says that she's seen grace manifest as spiritual WD-40, which I like. That's another great metaphor. Grace can loosen things up the way that WD-40 does, gets things unstuck. She talks about beautiful pre-assembled prayers like the Lord's Prayer or the Serenity Prayer, the prayer of St. Francis. She refers to these as the good china of prayers, by which she means they're lovely, but she doesn't use them as often as she does her own just impromptu sorts of prayer. She indicates that the good china only comes out maybe 1 out of 10 times for her. She endorses a God box, which is a nice idea. She says you should write down the thing that is distressing or obsessing you right now, put it in the box, and then leave it alone until you hear back. And she doesn't say exactly how we'll hear back, but The point is we get obsessed with things. We're unable to move on and get on with our lives because we're hamster wheeling on some little thing that's bothering us. And, you know, a conservative Christian might say, you know, bring that to God, lay that at God's feet, and let God deal with it. And so this is her version of that. The second great prayer she talks about is thanks, as in, oh my God, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. She says it's often said with a heaving exhalation of breath, the expulsion of a bellows. Thank you. So that's kind of a prayer of relief, I suppose, but it reminded me of the connection that Annie likes to talk about to Ruah, the notion that spirit, breath, and wind are all kind of the same thing. In fact, she uses that same metaphor again. She talks about grace as being a second wind. We seek clarity and resolution in our lives, but often what we get instead is the stamina and the will to go on. So that's that ruah again, isn't it? An important prayer, regardless of whether things are going well or not. You should be ready to say thanks in good times and bad times alike. And in particular, there's a Jimmy Buffett song called "The Attitude of Gratitude," which I've actually performed at church a couple times. And that's exactly the point she's getting at here, that you'll be better off if gratitude becomes a habit for you. That will make you a happier and a more balanced individual. She says you should never say the worst is over, because you're inviting even worse things to come your way if you do that. But she does say it's okay to say that something could have been so much worse. That she thinks that's not inviting disaster. And it's certainly true. Things could always be worse, couldn't they? And she also, I love this quote too. She says, sin is not the adult bookstore on the corner. It's the hard heart and all the isms, racism and sexism and all the other isms that we use to exclude people from the group. So again, that's not directly relevant to thanks, I guess, but it was in that section of the book, and I just really reacted to that quote. Her last great prayer is wow, and this is the hardest one to understand. We've all said prayers of thanks in our lives, I imagine, and we've certainly all asked for help when we were in dire straits. Wow is not something you normally think of as a prayer, but she talks about it being about having one's mind blown by the mesmerizing or the miraculous. She also says it's offered with a gasp, some sharp intake of breath. Once again, there's that idea of ruah showing up yet again in the book. She says, wow prayers often arise suddenly, a flash of insight or an unexpected moment of grace. The source of wow can be nature, or as my picture here in the background suggests, or it can be human. When I watch Fred Astaire dance, I can't do anything but say, wow, how does he do that? We can see art in a moment of time. We can see it in an instant. And this is holy, she says. She doesn't use the word holy a lot in the book, but that was one time she did. When all we can say is, wow, that's a prayer. So again, her idea of prayer being very, very broad and including this sort of amazement at something that we just can't comprehend ourselves, but we appreciate it. She mentions that wow is sometimes, phew, the prayer is in that way related to the notion of thanks, right? Thank goodness that truck didn't hit me. Wow, that was a close call. So wow is confounded with thanks a little bit. But for her, it's more about retaining one's capacity for awe and for wonder, because she says that's what enables newness and growth. If we ever lose our capacity to be amazed by things, we're done growing. And she even says when nothing new can get in, that's death. So wow is an important prayer for us as we go on our lives and continue to grow and evolve as people. We're supposed to talk about strengths and weaknesses in the book in our book review today. So here are the strengths that I found. First of all, I love her humor. I've read a couple of books by her. I had not read this one before, but I've certainly read others. And Traveling Mercies is another one that I like by her. And she's always using the humor to make her point. She's clever. The book is jammed with quotable lines related to spiritualism. She says, one quote is, what I wanted my whole life was relief from pressure, from isolation, from people's suffering, including my own, which was mostly mental, and entire political administrations. And remember, this was written long before Donald Trump came along. Her fourth grade prayer is, "Help me not to be such an ass," which is a prayer I should probably pray every day in my life. She says, "The three most terrible truths of our existence are that we are so ruined, we are so loved, and we're in charge of so little." And again, I just find that really, really struck a chord with me. We run around and we hamster wheel on so many things. We worry about so much. And in fact, we're really in charge of relatively little. And if we just allowed God to get in, we'd probably be a lot happier and a lot better people. There are deficits to the book too. It's certainly in the pop self-help genre. This is not Descartes or Kierkegaard, though Kierkegaard did talk about the three things one needs to be happy is something to do, something to hope for, and something to love. And so the notion of prayer, something to hope for and something to love, is certainly connected to Kierkegaard. But this is something that, her idea of spirituality is very broad, and it's probably not broad enough for a lot of people. She's clearly a theist without question. She doesn't maybe call God God, but she believes in God. And in fact, she's a Christian, and she even says a couple of times in the book, well, us Christian types sometimes talk about the following. So she puts herself in that camp deliberately. And again, this book was written a few years ago, and so maybe if she were to write it over again today, she'd even take a broader view of spirituality than she does. Finally, it's far from being her most significant work. This is sort of a light reading Lamott book that you give to a friend as a gift, I think. Though, again, all of her books have this characteristic of having clever advice, lots of great insight and metaphors for the point she's trying to make. So the deficits are certainly outweighed by the strengths, in my opinion. What about the relevance to music therapy practice? Well, Anne Lamott is a gifted writer and a spiritualist, but she's not a musician. She's definitely not a musician. There are not many references to music in the book at all. And this is typical of spirituality books, isn't it? Books that you pull off the shelf at the bookstore that are in the spirituality section are typically not that musical. So this isn't a huge indictment of the book. But she does tell a couple interesting stories about music in the book. One is that her parents were actually atheists who believed that God was responsible for most of the suffering in history, things like the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition. And she says that her parents had said, quote, "Worshipped at the Church of the New York Times, and we bowed down before our antique hi-fi cabinet, which held the Ark of the Covenant, Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk albums." So her parents were New York Times loving intellectuals for whom music, and specifically apparently modern jazz, was their spiritual focus. That was their altar, this hi-fi cabinet that held the Miles and Thelonious Monk records. And I thought it was interesting because, like many kids, she wound up rejecting her parents' approach and became a Christian. You hear so many stories about people who reject Christianity, maybe because they were wounded by the church. And so they reject only to disappoint their parents at becoming non-Christian. And Lamott actually went the other way. Her parents were sort of anti-Christian, anti-God, and she found herself going back the other direction. So I thought that was interesting. The other mention of music in the book, she does talk about music therapy near the end in the context of a boy named Mason, who's a 15-year-old with brain cancer. Mason is able to sing the word hands at the very end of a music therapist singing, "He's got the whole world in his hands." And this is remarkable because Mason hadn't said anything for more than a year when this moment took place. So she realized that this was huge. And when she witnessed this, she doesn't really say how she witnessed it, or even if she witnessed it firsthand, but she makes clear that she realizes that this is a wow moment, that Mason, and especially Mason's mother and father, were able to say wow, and this was a form of prayer. And so she's now realizing that while she's not a musician, music can deliver the wow moments that she's talking about. It's one of those things that she'd be including in her wow category. So while there's not a lot of music in the book, she certainly does talk about music, and it's clear there's a lot of lessons that we learned from this book that do apply to music therapy. For example, regular prayer is a spiritual practice that promotes physical and mental wellness, And music therapy can do this too. That's exactly what we want to do with music therapy much of the time, isn't it? Prayer and music therapy also both promote creativity and grounding, and that is also associated with wellness. So the connection between prayer and wellness and music and wellness, I think, is something that probably you would see in a lot of these books of this type, but it's certainly applicable for Anne Lamott's book here today. What about my own population of interest, which is persons with dementia and their family caregivers? Well, certainly folks with dementia, at least the ones that I work with at the moment, are very often familiar with traditional religiosity. Many of them are either Catholic or Lutheran in their backgrounds, and they certainly have an understanding of prayer. Many have a history of daily prayer. I'm not sure whether all of them are still doing it on a daily basis, but you know, the notion of help and thanks and wow, especially help and thanks, would be well familiar to them. Many of them are familiar with traditional Christian music, including hymns and songs often associated with prayer, like Sweet Hour of Prayer is one that comes immediately to mind. Taizé music, which is chant-like and also a form of prayer, would be less familiar to my folks, but many of these songs are slow and repetitive and relaxing. Veni Sancte Spiritu, Veni Sancte Spiritu, that kind of thing, that just is easy to learn and is a form of breath prayer, really, and should be learnable by this group as well, even though they wouldn't probably be familiar with Taizé. They'd be familiar with older things like the old rugged cross and how great thou art. They would be able to learn these simple chants that are, like I said, breath prayers. And I think that's a strong connection between what Anne's talking about and what we would do. PWDs and FCGs often struggle to find meaning in their current life experiences. PWDs often feel disconnected and irrelevant. FCGs can lose their sense of self as they struggle with role engulfment. Their new role of caring for a person with dementia can crowd out everything else in their lives. And so prayer is a way to promote meaning in the lives of both of these kinds of individuals, I think, as well as a feeling of connection to a higher power and the greater community of souls. I think especially that's important for FCGs, who often feel disconnected and isolated and need to be connected to a greater community. So music can deliver wow moments that promote feelings of newness and growth, and that's the strong connection, I think, between this book and what I do. So conclusions, the book was a very enjoyable read for me. I clearly enjoyed it. It would be a great primer for anyone looking to start a new spiritual practice involving prayer, because we're starting simple here. It's always better to start simple, and this book certainly motivates that. And of course, her use of humor is welcome. It's a quick read. It's a page turner, and it's a fun read. It's pretty short on musical references, which is its key deficit as far as we're concerned, but much of its advice can be translated into spirituality and wellness goals that are also directly addressed by a variety of music therapy method variations, like the breath prayer we just talked about. The idea of singing or speaking simple prayers along the 3 lines in the book, the help, thanks, and wow prayers, I think will be particularly useful for older populations, especially PWDs and their caregivers. So here's a full reference for the book. It was published in 2012 by Riverhead Books. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your attention.